Did Joseph Priestley truly discover oxygen? Or was he merely a witness to a phenomenon that he failed to understand? Historians of science have debated this question for centuries, and the answer depends on how one defines discovery itself. Priestley, an English clergyman and experimental philosopher with little formal training in chemistry, heated a piece of mercuric oxide with a simple burning lens in 1774 and collected a gas that allowed a candle to blaze with unusual vigor and a mouse to survive longer than in common air. He called it dephlogisticated air, a name rooted in the outdated phlogiston theory, a framework that insisted combustion released a mysterious substance rather than consuming oxygen. Yet, despite misinterpreting what he had produced, Priestley had touched the invisible element that sustains all life. It was left to Antoine Lavoisier in France to explain it correctly, to see it not as purified air, but as a new fundamental component of the atmosphere. So was Priestley the discoverer, or merely the messenger who stumbled upon a truth that others would define more clearly? This question opens a window into the life of Joseph Priestley, a man who was as much a thinker as he was a tinkerer, as much a theologian as he was a chemist. He lived at the crossroads of faith and reason, an age when empires shifted, revolutions erupted, and ideas about nature and society were being rewritten. Priestley's journey from a dissenting minister in rural England to an experimental philosopher in Birmingham, and finally an exile in America, mirrors the turbulence of the Enlightenment itself. His discovery of oxygen, misnamed, misunderstood, yet undeniably his stands as both a triumph of curiosity and a cautionary tale about the limits of human frameworks. Priestley reminds us that science is not only about correct theories, but also about daring to look, to ask, and to bottle something invisible from the air and call it a new substance. Joseph Priestley was born in 1,733 inches, the small town of Birstall, Yorkshire, into a modest family of cloth dressers and tradespeople. The England of his childhood was deeply religious, but also increasingly fractured. The official Church of England dominated public life, yet dissenting Protestant sects thrived in the shadows, often facing legal restrictions. Priestley's family were dissenters, and this identity shaped him from the beginning. His mother died when he was young, and he was taken in by relatives who saw promise in the boy's quick mind and restless curiosity. They sent him to schools run by dissenting ministers, where education was often broader and more questioning than at the established Anglican institutions. It was there that Priestley encountered not only the Bible and theology, but also Latin, Greek, and mathematics. He was frail in health and thought for a time that he might die young, but his appetite for knowledge gave him purpose. As he grew, his intellectual curiosity extended beyond theology and the scriptures. He began to devour works of philosophy, natural science, and even the controversial writings of free thinkers who dared to question the orthodoxies of the day. His guardians recognized his remarkable intellect and, despite their limited means, encouraged him to pursue a serious education. This was an act of both faith and defiance, for to support a young dissenter in seeking advanced learning was to prepare him for a life outside the privileged structures of the Anglican establishment. Priestley embraced that destiny willingly, for he was never one to bend easily to authority. When he entered the dissenting academies that served as universities for those excluded from Oxford and Cambridge, Priestley found himself in an environment where ideas collided and curiosity was encouraged. These academies were not rich in resources, but they were rich in debate. It was here that he sharpened his mind and his voice, learning not only the languages of scholarship, but also the rhetoric of controversy. He developed a fascination with languages, teaching himself Hebrew and other tongues in addition to Latin and Greek. He immersed himself in metaphysics and logic, but also in the early experimental sciences, taking seriously the notion that the natural world was a second book of God, a revelation written in the language of nature itself. Priestley's earliest ambition was to become a minister, and in due course he took up that role. His sermons revealed him as a man of passion and intellect, eager to guide his congregation toward a rational faith. But they also revealed his tendency to unsettle those who expected simple piety. He questioned long-held doctrines, refusing to accept mysteries where reason might be applied. To some, this was invigorating, a sign of a new age of enlightened Christianity. To others, it was dangerous, even heretical. Yet Priestley could not restrain himself. His very nature was to push, to test, to question. While serving in these early ministries, Priestley began to correspond with men of science. He had read of Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity and began to replicate and expand upon them. He did not have great wealth to equip a laboratory, but with resourcefulness he assembled enough to conduct demonstrations. His writings on electricity gained notice, culminating in his publication of a comprehensive history of electrical research. This work, though not filled with original discoveries, was deeply respected for its breadth and clarity. Franklin himself admired it, and a connection was formed that would link Priestley not only to one of the greatest minds of the century, but also to the wider intellectual community of Europe and America. Science for Priestley was never a separate pursuit from his ministry or his philosophy. He saw all as part of one great endeavor, to uncover truth. Nature and Scripture were not in conflict, for both were revelations from the same divine source. This conviction allowed him to approach science with a sense of reverence, even as he approached theology with a sense of logic. It was precisely this blending of reverence and reason that set him on the path toward his experiments with air. The 18th century's understanding of air was primitive compared to today. To most thinkers, it was a single, undifferentiated substance, yet hints of complexity were emerging. Experiments showed that air could be spoiled by fire or respiration, and sometimes restored by plants. Priestley, with his love of simple but revealing experiments, found this mystery irresistible. Using glass jars inverted over water or mercury, he began to collect gases produced by various reactions. His notebooks filled with observations of how these airs behaved. Some extinguished flames, others made them brighter. Some suffocated animals, others seemed to refresh them. He cataloged them with a patience that bordered on obsession. Through these investigations, he identified what we now know as carbon dioxide, describing it as an air that made candles die and animals suffocate, but which could be absorbed by water to produce a pleasant, tangy taste. He studied what we call nitrous oxide, noticing its peculiar effects. He found ammonia, sulfur dioxide, and other gases, each with its own properties. Though his interpretations were bound by the phlogiston theory, the sheer wealth of data he amassed made him one of the leading pneumatic experimenters of his age. His discovery that plants could restore air spoiled by animals was among his most profound, hinting at the balance of nature long before photosynthesis was understood. And then came that August day in 1774, in the laboratory of a friend, when he focused the rays of the sun through a burning lens upon a sample of red mercuric oxide. The gas that poured forth was unlike any he had seen. A candle sprang to brilliant life in it. A mouse survived longer than expected. When he dared to breathe it, he felt a rush of clarity, a brightness in his lungs, as if the very act of respiration had become purer. He wrote of its exhilarating quality, marveling at its potential. He called it dephlogisticated air, the purest form of air yet obtained. To him, it was evidence that air could indeed be cleansed of phlogiston, a confirmation of his framework. To us, it was oxygen, the element without which none of us could live. The irony of Priestley's discovery was that, though he had in his hands the key to a new chemistry, he did not grasp its meaning. He continued to cling to phlogiston, weaving ever more complicated explanations to fit the evidence into the old theory. It would be Lavoisier, with his insistence on careful measurement and his rejection of phlogiston, who would correctly interpret the phenomenon. To Lavoisier, Priestley's dephlogisticated air was not a purified medium, but a new substance entirely, one that combined with other materials in combustion and respiration. Oxygen, he named it, and with that naming the age of modern chemistry was born. Yet to diminish Priestley on this account would be to misunderstand the nature of discovery. Science advances through a chain of observations, experiments, and interpretations. Priestley may not have interpreted correctly, but he observed, he experimented, and he revealed. Without his daring to breathe the gas, to light the candle, to test the mouse, Lavoisier's theory would have lacked its crucial evidence. Discovery is not only the making of correct theories, but the boldness to uncover phenomena that others can later explain. In this sense, Priestley's claim to the discovery of oxygen remains secure. Even as he pursued these experiments, Priestley's theological writings stirred storms of controversy. He attacked the doctrine of the Trinity, arguing for a strict monotheism that placed him at odds with the Church of England. He promoted a rational Christianity, one that saw Jesus as a great moral teacher but not a divine being in the orthodox sense. These positions aligned him with the growing Unitarian movement, and he became one of its most prominent advocates. To conservatives, he was a dangerous heretic undermining the fabric of Christian faith. To reformers, he was a prophet of a new, enlightened religion. Priestley's intellectual home became Birmingham, where he joined the Lunar Society, an informal group of industrialists, inventors, and philosophers who met under the full moon to share ideas. Among them were James Watt, the great improver of the steam engine, Matthew Boulton, the industrial magnate, and Erasmus Darwin, physician and poet, grandfather of Charles Darwin. In this circle, Priestley found stimulation and support. It was here that he conducted many of his experiments, surrounded by men who were themselves reshaping the world. But ideas have consequences, and Priestley's support for radical causes would soon bring him peril. He applauded the American Revolution, praising the colonists for resisting tyranny. He welcomed the French Revolution as a dawn of liberty, even as it descended into violence. To him, these upheavals were the unfolding of progress, the advance of reason and freedom against superstition and oppression. To many in England, however, they were threats to stability, dangerous examples that could inflame rebellion at home. Priestley's outspoken support for revolution, combined with his religious dissent, made him a target. In July 1791, during celebrations of the second anniversary of the French Revolution, a mob descended upon Birmingham. Their fury was directed at dissenters, and Priestley was foremost among them. His home and laboratory were attacked, his books and instruments destroyed, his manuscripts burned. He and his family fled for their lives. The riot marked a violent turning point. Priestley was no longer merely a controversial thinker. He was an exile within his own country. He tried to rebuild, but the hostility would not fade. In 1794, he made the painful decision to leave England altogether, emigrating to America. There, in the young republic he had so admired, he sought refuge. He settled in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, where he lived out his remaining years. Though he continued to write, to experiment, and to preach, his influence waned. He was respected by some, including the American founding fathers who admired his science and his support for liberty, but he never again held the prominence he had in England. Priestley died in 1804, a man who had lived at the intersection of science, religion, and politics, and who had paid the price of controversy. Yet his legacy endured. In chemistry, he remains the man who first liberated oxygen. In theology, he is remembered as a founder of Unitarianism. In politics, he stands as a voice for liberty and reason, even in the face of persecution. His life reminds us that discovery is rarely clean or uncontested. It is messy, human, and fraught with paradox. But it is precisely in that paradox that greatness often lies. Priestley's exile in America did not dampen his determination to continue his inquiries into both science and religion, though the scale of his work was diminished. In Northumberland, Pennsylvania, he established a modest laboratory, rebuilding with what little resources he could gather. The ruins of his Birmingham library and laboratory haunted him, for the loss had been immense, yet he refused to let destruction define the end of his intellectual life. He still pursued experiments with airs, still wrote theological treatises, still defended rational Christianity in pamphlets that stirred debates even across the Atlantic. Visitors came to see him, curious about the famous dissenter and discoverer, and some among the new American elite admired his courage. Thomas Jefferson spoke well of him, acknowledging the role Priestley's ideas had played in shaping enlightenment, thought that nurtured the revolution. To Priestley, America represented both refuge and opportunity, though he never ceased to feel a pang of loss for England, the land that had turned against him. In his American years, Priestley devoted much energy to defending his earlier discoveries and ideas. The triumph of Lavoisier's oxygen theory had swept across Europe, establishing a new foundation for chemistry, yet Priestley remained unconvinced. He clung to phlogiston with almost stubborn loyalty, constructing increasingly elaborate defenses against the growing tide of evidence. To modern readers, this persistence seems like folly, but to Priestley it was fidelity to a framework he believed still held explanatory power. He was not alone. Other natural philosophers also resisted the shift, for scientific revolutions rarely win all converts at once. His unwillingness to abandon phlogiston cost him scientific prestige, yet it also revealed a man who valued consistency and principle above reputation. He had always been driven less by acclaim than by conviction, and conviction guided him even when it left him isolated. His American laboratory became a place not only of chemistry, but of philosophy. Young students and local thinkers visited, eager to learn from the man who had once breathed the purest air known to man. He demonstrated experiments with gases, showing them the same tricks of flame and mouse that had astonished his English audiences decades earlier. Though outdated in the eyes of European science, in America these displays still carried wonder. For Priestley, they were reminders that discovery is not only about theory, but about experience, about the awe of watching a candle flare to life in a jar of invisible substance. That awe, he believed, was a bridge between science and faith, a glimpse of the Creator's rational order in the world. Priestley's theology remained as bold as ever. He continued to preach and write in defense of Unitarianism, challenging the orthodoxies of Trinitarian Christianity. His work circulated widely among dissenting communities in America, encouraging them to pursue a rational religion grounded in Scripture and reason rather than tradition and mystery. He corresponded with other religious radicals, debating points of doctrine with the same intensity he once debated chemical properties. To him, truth was a single pursuit that embraced both the heavens of faith and the elements of matter. The God who created oxygen, he argued, was the same God who endowed humanity with reason to discover it. To deny reason in religion was to deny the gift of God himself. Even in exile, Priestley's pen never rested. He produced volumes of theological and philosophical writings, including his massive History of the Corruptions of Christianity, which traced how the pure faith of Jesus had, in his view, been twisted by centuries of dogma. This work had earned him the scorn of Orthodox clergy in England, and in America it continued to provoke strong reactions. Some hailed him as a liberator of minds, others cursed him as a corrupter of souls. He was not naive about the divisions he caused. He once admitted that he seemed destined always to live in controversy, unable to avoid conflict where truth was at stake. Yet he bore that destiny with stubborn dignity, never silencing himself for the sake of peace. Politically, too, Priestley remained engaged. He admired the American experiment in Republican government, though he sometimes worried about the same dangers of mob rule that had scarred his view of the French Revolution's later years. He corresponded with leaders like Jefferson and Adams, offering opinions on governance, liberty, and education. He saw America as fertile ground for the principles of reason and freedom he had long cherished, though he also recognized the contradictions of slavery and inequality that stained its ideals. His own status as a refugee, welcomed yet always somewhat apart, gave him a perspective both hopeful and wary. In reflecting on his life, Priestley sometimes expressed regret at the divisions his work had caused, yet he never doubted the path he had taken. He wrote of himself as a servant of truth, compelled to follow reason wherever it led, whether to chemical experiments or theological disputes. He recognized that others saw him as contentious, even reckless, but he insisted that conscience demanded honesty. To suppress truth for comfort was, to him, a betrayal not only of reason, but of God. His conscience was his compass, and it led him through storms that would have broken a lesser man. The paradox of Joseph Priestley is that he was at once ahead of his time and behind it. He pioneered experiments that laid the groundwork for modern chemistry, yet clung to a theory that would soon be discarded. He envisioned a rational religion that appealed to Enlightenment thinkers, yet alienated masses who preferred the comfort of tradition. He supported revolutions in the name of liberty, yet suffered from the violence they unleashed. He embodied the Enlightenment's faith in reason and progress, yet bore the scars of its upheavals. To study his life is to study the Enlightenment itself, in all its promise and peril. When he died in 1804, Priestley was 71 years old, a respectable age for a man who had once thought himself doomed to frail youth. His death was quiet, in his American home, surrounded by family. He left behind not only volumes of books and scattered laboratory apparatus, but also a legacy that spanned continents. In England, he was remembered with ambivalence, at once honored for his science and despised for his politics. In France, his name was linked to the revolution of chemistry, though Lavoisier claimed the greater share of glory. In America, he was respected as a friend of liberty and knowledge, though never fully embraced as one of their own. He belonged everywhere and nowhere, a citizen of reason more than of any single nation. His discovery of oxygen remains the centerpiece of his legacy. To imagine him bending over his apparatus, carefully positioning the burning lens to focus sunlight onto a sample of red powder, is to see science in its most human form, improvised, imperfect, yet profoundly daring. The simplicity of his equipment contrasts with the magnitude of his achievement. No elaborate machines, no vast laboratories, just glass jars, mercury, sunlight, and a curious mind willing to test the unknown by breathing it into his own lungs. That moment of inhalation, when he felt the sharp freshness of dephlogisticated air, stands as one of the great images of experimental science. It is the breath of discovery itself, the inhaling of truth even before it is understood. In the centuries since, Priestley has been commemorated in various ways. Statues of him stand in his native Yorkshire and in Pennsylvania. Schools and institutions bear his name. Chemists honor him as a pioneer of their field, though they sometimes note his errors with a smile. Theological scholars remember him as a radical dissenter whose influence on Unitarianism was profound. Historians of ideas place him among the voices that bridge the old world and the new, the age of superstition and the age of reason. Each field claims a part of him, yet none can claim him whole, for Priestley was too complex, too paradoxical, to fit neatly into any one narrative. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Joseph Priestley. Discovery is not tidy, life is not consistent. To live as he lived at the edge of knowledge and belief is to invite contradiction. Yet in those contradictions, in that mixture of brilliance and blindness, lies the true measure of a human seeker. Priestley's life was not the story of a flawless genius, but of a man who dared to ask, to test, to challenge, and to believe. His oxygen continues to fill our lungs, whether we name it by his mistaken term or by Lavoisier's triumph. His ideas continue to inspire and provoke whether we agree or resist. His legacy is air itself, invisible, essential, and impossible to contain in a single vessel. Priestley's house in Northumberland looked out over the Susquehanna, and on clear mornings the river's slow brightness seemed to him like an open page on which a patient reader might trace the currents of Providence. He rose early, not out of habit so much as necessity. Age had thinned his sleep, and the urge to set down one more thought on air, on Scripture, on civil liberty, pushed him to his desk before the sun had wholly burned the mist from the water. Paper and glass remained his companions, the quire and the retort, the quill and the jar inverted over a basin. He had fewer instruments than in Birmingham, fewer friends at hand to argue with by moonlight, yet the same hunger for clarity worked in him. He would copy a verse from the Gospel in the margin, then describe an experiment on the page, as if the breath of reason could flow unbroken from one form of revelation to the other. Even his detractors recognized the singularity of this habit. The minister who numbered errors as carefully as he numbered arguments, the chemist who footnoted a sermon with a mouse and a candle, it would be comfortable to say that exile softened him, made him conciliatory, but that would do violence to his nature. The trials of his last decade did not blunt his convictions. They refined them. In correspondence, he conceded that the scenes in Paris had horrified him, and that liberty without conscience dissolved into factions that called themselves virtuous while sharpening the blade. Yet he never ceased to believe that the right of private judgment, exercised soberly and in good faith, was the only honest guard against tyranny, whether the tyranny of a palace, a pulpit, or a fashionable theory. It is this same temper that explains, if it does not excuse, his fidelity to phlogiston when the chemists around him moved on. He had been trained all his life to distrust the authority of received systems when the phenomena refused to bow to them. If he looked from a different angle and saw in his dephlogisticated air a purer medium rather than a distinct principle, it was because he judged the scaffolding by the steadiness of the hand that erected it, not by the elegance of the blueprint. He trusted what he had seen and touched. He trusted the mouse scurrying longer, the candle lifting its tongue of flame, the startling vivacity in his own chest. In such moments he felt no shame that the language he used to name the thing would later be removed from the dictionary. He had breathed it. That was proof enough of reality, even if its grammar would be written by another. Visitors, when they came, found a man neither sainted by suffering nor soured by it, but alive to particulars, the way a stopper sat in a neck of glass, the exact phrasing of a verse in Acts, the placement of a comma in a political pamphlet that could tilt an argument from principle to prejudice. He would set a jar in a dish of water, capture a little gas as if it were a moth one didn't wish to harm, and while the bubble climbed, he would tell a story of Franklin that ended not in worship but in friendship, a kite string wet with rain, a key that was not quite the key of the fable, the way the old philosopher's laugh could put a room at its ease. Then he would return to his theme without transition, explaining that electricity had taught Europe to distrust miracle for the sake of mechanism, and that chemistry, if rightly understood, would teach it to distrust mechanism for the sake of law. For law, he would say, pressing his palm on the table as if feeling the grain, is the constant will of the Creator inscribed in matter and mind alike. Those present might not agree with his theology, but the cadence of the proposition caught at them. The air in the jar was not merely a reagent. It was a sentence from that script he believed to be universal. News from Europe reached him in tatters. Lavoisier sent to the guillotine in the year 2, a martyr not to error, but to an accountant's ledger and the politics of envy. The old academies convulsed and reconvened under new names, the very word chemist acquiring a shadow of suspicion, and then, by stages, a sheen of indispensability as industry learned to conscript affinities. He mourned the Frenchman sincerely. He had opposed him in doctrine, sometimes harshly in print, but he had never wished him ill. In private, he admitted that Lavoisier's balances had disciplined an art too long satisfied with spectacle. He did not retract his positions, yet grief for a rival betrayed a generosity a partisan history might otherwise miss. The revolution of chemistry had been bloodless in the laboratory and bloody in the street. He would have preferred the reverse sharp quarrels among savants and quiet in the markets, but a man does not choose the theater in which his age assembles. What he did choose, and never abandoned, was pedagogy. He taught always. A neighbor's son spent an afternoon at his table and emerged infected with a desire to measure the air that accumulated in pond scum beneath summer heat. A printer's apprentice borrowed a tract on the right of private judgment and discovered the perilous joy of thinking aloud. A Unitarian layman puzzled out, with the doctor's patient help, what it might mean that Jesus called the Father greater than himself. In each case, Priestley behaved as though he were only passing a flame along a row of wicks. The worth of the act did not depend in his mind on whether the light would be named oxygen or something else, whether the sermon would impress a magistrate or anger him. What mattered was continuity, that inquiry should not be snuffed by convenience, that conscience should not be closeted for company's sake, that breath itself be understood not as a superstition but as a gift mediated by causes one could trace. He rode into controversy not because he hungered for notoriety, but because the genre appealed to his moral geometry. An opponent proposes. He replies, each is forced to define terms, state premises, enumerate experiments, expose hidden prejudices. Thus a cloud of assertion condenses into droplets that can be weighed. His enemies complained of his tone too sure, too sharp, too ready to impute ignorance, where perhaps only haste had erred, and they were sometimes right. But even when he wounded, he worked toward an end he thought charitable, to strip pomp from argument and bring it under the discipline of evidence and reason. He feared a piety that refused examination as much as he feared a fashion that called itself science while bowing to authority of a new kind. Theology, he once wrote, should fear experiment no more than chemistry should fear conscience. It is an unusual injunction, and one understands at once why both parsons and professors found him inconvenient. If the center of his scientific story is that sunbright lens over the red powder that yielded a gas in which life and flame rejoiced, the periphery is a ring of smaller illuminations that together make a constellation. He showed that water, into which fixed air had been absorbed, acquired a sprightliness agreeable to the palate, an observation that would, by circuitous paths, open a century of effervescence on dinner tables. He contrived a way to keep airs from dissolving into vagueness by trapping them over mercury rather than water, thereby preserving those that fled at the first hint of dissolution. He taught that green plants, in light, had the power to repair what flames and lungs had ruined, a divine economy that later ages would draw as equations, but which he felt in the chest on a June afternoon when the leaves themselves seemed to exhale mercy. He handled no photosynthetic pigment, weighed no quantum of photons, yet he grasped the reciprocity that made the globe habitable long before cycle had become a scientific commonplace. These were not accidents. They were the fruits of a temperament that trusted repeated touch more than grand schema, that preferred to ask a question one more time with a different jar rather than declare a system complete. The small American town could not grant him the friction he had once enjoyed, the corrective, maddening, fertilizing talk of the lunar circle in Birmingham and solitude took its toll. He missed the sudden way a room would brighten when Watt entered, the way Bolton would thump a fist on a table at a good phrase, the medico-poet Darwin spinning images that turned pistons and plants into cousins. In Northumberland, the knight was less argumentative. He compensated by arguing on paper. He wrote histories of early Christianity with an experimentalist temperament, sifting testimonies as if they were the residues of reactions, comparing manuscripts like variants in a series, describing corruption not as malice alone, but as the slow addition of extraneous matter under heat and pressure. He printed tracts on education in a republic, insisting that young minds be habituated to evidence rather than to catechisms of either church or party. He defended dissent not as the privilege of the contrary, but as the duty of all communities that wished to distinguish zeal from truth. In each domain the metaphor of air returned. Opinion needed circulation. Authority, if not ventilated, grew foul. A schoolroom in which only one thought was allowed to burn would soon extinguish itself. Those who judge a life by its final doctrines will say that Priestley lost. Oxygen dethroned dephlogisticated air not by vote, but by a consistency of consequences that attached to it like iron filings to a magnet. Yet those who judge by acts see a different balance. They note the courage of a man placing his own face over the mouth of a vessel filled with an unknown, hoping that the god of order had not hidden dragon's breath under red powder. They note the sequence of attentions, mouse, candle, chest, that insisted science is not a set of symbols on a slate, but a commerce between the world and our most intimate processes. They note, too, the continuity of a conscience that would not, even for the comfort of professional agreement, speak against what it believed the page of nature declared. In that sense, the quarrel between Lavoisier and Priestley becomes less a morality play than a duet, one giving the language that law required, the other giving the drama that law alone cannot animate. Priestley's children, and then their children, carried his books and some of his glass with them as the American century opened. The jars, scuffed and not quite uniform, looked like any farmer's vessels, until one remembered that through such throats the world had first tasted a name for breath. Visitors decades later would peer at them behind a case and feel a tug of sympathy for homemade science, for the way the Enlightenment often lived not under domes, but in back rooms with ordinary windows. The lesson is not nostalgia. It is responsibility. If the laws of the atmosphere can be glimpsed with so little equipment, then the task of inquiry cannot be left to princely foundations alone. Priestley would have liked that inference. He distrusted monopolies of learning as much as monopolies of trade. On certain evenings, when the weather and his lungs permitted, he walked the river road and rehearsed aloud the arguments he would write in the morning. Passers-by heard fragments, a defense of the unity of God set beside a defense of experimental modesty, a rebuke to those who condemned a doctrine without reading its sources set beside a rebuke to those who praised a cause without counting its costs. He spoke as though he were forever in a disputation, yet the tone was not harsh so much as urgent. Time was short. He wanted, before he put down the pen, to leave behind not only the account of a handful of errors, but a pedagogy of freedom. How to test without sneer, how to doubt without surrender, how to love truth well enough to endure the solitude it sometimes enforces. That solitude visited him more frequently in his last years. Some friends died, some moved, some wrote less often. He answered slower too, not because his interest waned, but because the body extracted a longer tariff for each exertion. Still, there were days of bright labor. A letter came from a young man in Philadelphia who had repeated one of the doctor's experiments and added a small refinement. Priestley replied with praise, unmingled with envy, and then, almost incidentally, suggested a further test the youth had not imagined. A minister from Boston sent an essay arguing for wider toleration. Priestley annotated the margins with approvals and cautions, fearing both lukewarmness that called itself tolerance and heat that called itself zeal. A farmer brought a bottle of spring water, whose taste he found oddly cheering. Priestley showed him how earth, air, and stone met in a cup, and how what pleased the tongue could, in excess, burden the blood. On such days one sees most clearly what his enemies could not afford to admit, that his obstinacy was the shadow of his fidelity, that his disputes were the accidents of a vocation to teach. On his desk lay, to the end, the two books he considered one, the Scriptures and the Book of Nature. In the first he underlined sentences that testified to God's unity and to the dignity of reason. In the second he penciled numbers beside bubbles, arrows beside curves of flame. He believed that both volumes, rightly read, would reconcile what centuries had driven apart, piety and inquiry. There are many who find this union naive, and history has given them ammunition. Yet in Priestley's case, the aspiration did not produce a timid science or a credulous faith. It produced instead a style of attention at once humane and exact, prepared to admit error without learning to love it, eager to transfer credit to a rival without surrendering the right to argue. If he misnamed oxygen, he also named courage in a manner that, for those who care how knowledge is born, remains exemplary. He was not a saint, and the hagiography that sometimes clings to great discoverers would embarrass him. He could be irritable in controversy, inattentive to the social tact that oils the machine of institutions, careless of the wounds a sentence can leave when it strikes too squarely at a colleague's pride. He could underestimate the role of imagination in theory building even as he exercised imagination in the laboratory. He could trust that public reason would prevail in assemblies where private fear and advantage did most of the voting. But he was unmistakably brave. It is a word too easily awarded to soldiers alone. To sit alone with a jar of unknown air and choose to inhale is an act of a soldierly kind, not rash, not vainglorious, but a wager placed on the orderliness of a world one did not make and on whose laws one's life depends. When the end came, it was without theatrics. He had the consolation, if that is the word of knowing his name, would not vanish. He also had the disquiet, if that is the word, of knowing the world would remember him partly through a correction. His last paragraph circle, as his first had, around conscience. He commends to those who will outlive him the practice of testing their dearest opinions as sternly as they test a gas. He asks them to forgive excesses of manner in a man who never learned to prefer civility to candor. He reminds them finally that liberty is a kind of air and must be kept clean by the duties of understanding and forbearance. Then the pen stops, the river goes on. In the rooms where his glass remains, the light shifts by degrees, and now and then a visitor stranger, student, skeptic, believer leans close to the faint imperfections in an 18th century vessel and imagines the curve of a breath that once passed there, taking into itself a nameless clarity that another would later christen. The memory of Priestley, after his death in 1804, moved quickly into the realm of symbol as well as fact, for men and women in Britain, America, and beyond needed to decide what this restless dissenter represented. To some, he was the archetype of dangerous rationalism, a minister who had undermined doctrine and emboldened mobs, a chemist who clung stubbornly to an error when others had discovered the truth. To others, he was a martyr of conscience, a victim of persecution who had dared to combine experiment with faith and had paid the price of independence. In either case, the arguments around his name testify to the power of his life. No one could dismiss him as irrelevant. He had touched too many currents of his century. Chemists debated the legacy of his experiments. Unitarians revered his sermons, politicians recalled his pamphlets, and exiles recognized in him a companion spirit. His very contradictions kept him alive in memory, for they reflected the contradictions of the age itself. The Enlightenment was not a single harmony, but a set of unresolved chords, and Priestley's life embodied their resonance. If he misread oxygen, he also revealed it. If he failed to keep England's favor, he helped America imagine itself more generous. If his pen produced quarrels, it also produced courage. Those who passed judgment on him were, in truth, passing judgment on the Enlightenment's wager. That reason, if trusted, could reconcile faith, science, and liberty. That wager has never been fully settled, and so Priestley continues to haunt the debates of posterity like a ghost of breath itself, invisible yet undeniable, both taken for granted and never exhausted. In the years that followed his passing, biographies began to appear, some written with the cool detachment of chroniclers, and others with the heat of advocacy, for no account of Joseph Priestley could avoid taking sides. Admirers portrayed him as the prototype of the modern scientific spirit, fearless in questioning tradition and unafraid to expose himself to the risk of error. Critics, by contrast, painted him as an obstinate sectary, a man who mistook controversy for truth and whose very talents made his mistakes more dangerous. Yet even these enemies could not erase the central fact that he had opened a door in chemistry that no one could close again. His name, tethered to oxygen, whether as discoverer or misinterpreter, lodged itself in textbooks and experiments, in lecture halls and laboratories, ensuring that every student of nature would at least pronounce him, if not praise him. What he had breathed in that moment by the lens and the red powder had in a sense been breathed by all generations after him, for it was not only the substance of life, but the substance of intellectual daring. The dissenting academies where he learned, the lunar circle where he debated, the Pennsylvania refuge where he died, all became stages in a drama larger than the man himself, the drama of humanity, learning to trust the evidence of air and conscience over the dictates of custom. When statues were raised, they bore not the aura of conquest, but the stance of a teacher pointing to an unseen horizon, reminding passers-by that knowledge is both gift and burden. And so his legacy persisted, neither tidy nor tame, but alive, as restless as breath itself, urging each new age to ask whether we have truly learned to honor reason, or whether, like Priestley, we too cling to phlogistons of our own, comforting errors that await the clarity of another generation's flame. In classrooms of the 19th century, his image began to flicker between hero and cautionary tale, invoked by lecturers who wished to inspire curiosity and by others who wished to warn against stubbornness, and yet in both versions he remained present, an unavoidable figure in the genealogy of chemistry. His insistence on phlogiston, far from banishing him, made him more memorable, for students could measure the distance between his observation and his interpretation and learn that science advances not by flawless leaps, but by a dialogue between error and correction. To Unitarians on both sides of the Atlantic, he became something more intimate, a father whose arguments had laid the groundwork for their freedom of worship and whose exile symbolized the price of conscience. Sermons remembered his courage, pamphlets reprinted his tracts, and the name Priestley stood for rational faith even among those who had never handled a jar of air. Politicians, too, found in him an emblem of the rights of dissent, and in America his grave was visited by citizens who felt that the Republic had honored itself by offering sanctuary to a man whom monarchy had rejected. Thus, the chemist who discovered oxygen and the minister who denied the Trinity merged into one legend, each side feeding the other, for breath and belief alike testified to liberty. The pattern of his life became a parable repeated in books and speeches, that truth is often greeted first with ridicule, then with violence, and only at last with recognition, and that those who wish to serve it must be ready to endure all three stages. And so, long after the jars had been emptied and the sermons forgotten, his story continued to circulate like air itself, invisible yet essential, sustaining debates about science, religion, and freedom with a quiet persistence that refused extinction. As the century deepened and new sciences arose, his name was linked with discoveries he could not have imagined, for oxygen became the foundation of physiology, of combustion theory, of industrial processes, and of medicine, and every time a textbook traced the line backward, it stopped at Priestley bending over his lens and powder. In laboratories where steel was smelted and in hospitals where lungs were studied, echoes of his moment of astonishment persisted. To many he seemed like a prophet who had glimpsed a land he could not enter, pointing the way but never crossing the threshold, for Lavoisier and his successors had built the new chemistry on principles foreign to Priestley's vocabulary. Yet even this distance gave his story power, for it showed that discovery is larger than the discoverer, that truth is not the property of one man, but the inheritance of many. Meanwhile, theologians who sought a faith compatible with reason continued to cite him, sometimes gently correcting his excesses, sometimes fiercely defending his courage. His willingness to let Scripture be examined like an experiment gave license to generations who believed that reverence and criticism need not be enemies. And political reformers invoked his persecution as a reminder that liberty of conscience was fragile, easily trampled when crowds or governments confused dissent with treason. Thus his memory served as a crossroads where chemists, preachers, and reformers could meet, each claiming him in part, none claiming him whole, yet all acknowledging that the breath he once captured had spread into the air of history itself, mingling with every subsequent age like the oxygen he first named dephlogisticated air. By the mid-19th century, when chemists spoke of the new atomic theory and when physiology mapped the circulation of blood with a precision Priestley never knew, his name lingered not as a fossil but as an ancestor whose daring still commanded respect. Journals cited his experiments as the dawn of pneumatic chemistry, the beginning of an age in which air was no longer the invisible given but a field of investigation rich with species, each bearing properties crucial to life and industry. Teachers retold the anecdote of him breathing the new air, letting students feel the thrill of risk and the intimacy of science, for it is one thing to weigh a reaction and another to let its product mingle with your own body. This image fixed itself in the imagination, Priestley inhaling the future. Writers compared him to Columbus sighting land, yet naming it wrongly, or to a prophet glimpsing a promised country from a mountain he would never climb. The error of phlogiston, far from diminishing him, gave the story its tragic dignity, for it showed how even great observers may be bound by the frameworks of their age, and how truth requires both the one who sees and the one who interprets. Thus he remained a chapter not to be skipped, for the history of science is not a march of triumphs, but a dialogue of mistakes corrected, of visions half grasped, of courage that exceeds comprehension. Meanwhile, Unitarians built seminaries and congregations with his writings as foundation stones. They cherished his insistence that Christ was not God but man, and that reason is the proper lamp of faith. In New England pulpits, his tracts were quoted, and his exile was retold as a sermon on liberty. In Britain, dissenters remembered the Birmingham riots as proof that conscience may suffer violence when truth threatens privilege. For them, Priestley was a patron saint of the rational pulpit, a man who had dared to read Scripture with fresh eyes and had paid with ashes of books and instruments. His theology, though controversial, lived on in communities that prized freedom of inquiry as a religious duty. Even those who rejected his conclusions felt the shock of his method, for he had opened windows in a house too long, shuttered, letting in a draught of reason that could not easily be stilled. Political reformers, too, invoked his life. Liberals who pressed for wider suffrage and for the rights of dissenters found in Priestley a witness to the costs of repression. His writings on government and education circulated long after his death, and his correspondence with Jefferson was reprinted to remind Republicans that liberty of thought was kin to liberty of vote. When radicals in England invoked his name, They spoke of him as proof that persecution could drive even the mildest philosopher into exile, and that the health of a state could be judged by how it treated its heretics. Thus his ashes in America fertilized debates in Europe, his voice carried across the Atlantic like the air currents he once studied, invisible yet influential. In laboratories, new generations discovered gases beyond his imagining, noble gases, reactive halogens, anesthetics that dulled pain. Yet in every triumph there was an echo of Priestley's jars, of the simple glass overturned in water, of the lens catching sunlight. Chemists marveled at the primitive tools by which he had nonetheless touched the essential. The narrative grew that modern science owed as much to curiosity and courage as to apparatus, and Priestley stood as patron of that moral. Students who grumbled at the tedium of weighing and titrating were reminded that their art began with a dissenting minister who chased bubbles in a jar and dared to taste the world. To breathe an unknown air was reckless, but it was also trust in the order of nature, trust that the Creator had written laws not to trap but to reveal. This blend of piety and experiment, of sermon and spectacle, gave his story a texture unique among the fathers of chemistry. Writers of the Victorian age often painted him against the darker backdrop of Lavoisier's fate. The French chemist, guillotined in the Terror, became the martyr of order destroyed by chaos, while Priestley, fleeing mobs, became the exile of reason driven out by fanaticism. Together they embodied the Enlightenment's fragility, knowledge vulnerable to politics, truth endangered by violence. Their names were paired in essays as twin victims of intolerance, though in different lands and with different outcomes. For some, Lavoisier was the hero of precision, Priestley the hero of curiosity. One gave chemistry its law, the other its life. To study them together was to see that science needs both the balance of the ledger and the breath of risk. As industrialization spread, oxygen itself took on new meanings. It became the agent of steel furnaces, the rescuer in hospitals, the symbol of vitality in literature. And always, when oxygen was invoked, Priestley's shadow appeared. He had called it dephlogisticated air, yet the misnomer mattered less than the courage to isolate it. Even in error he had given the world the possibility of truth, for without his jar and his mouse and his breath there would have been nothing for Lavoisier to rename. Historians emphasized this interplay, that discovery is a chain, not a coronation, and that each link, however flawed, is indispensable. Thus Priestley's place was secure, not as the final word, but as the necessary beginning. When the 20th century dawned and science accelerated into realms beyond his vision electrons, relativity, quantum mechanics, his story was still told. It reminded an age intoxicated with novelty that progress rests on the shoulders of those who dared first to ask simple questions. What is in the air? Why does a candle die? Can a plant restore what fire consumes? Such questions seem childish beside particle accelerators. Yet without them, the later questions would have had no air to breathe. Priestley's jars, humble and breakable, became icons of the power of curiosity. Museums displayed them with reverence, and children pressed faces to the glass cases, imagining the moment when an ordinary man in an ordinary room first trapped the extraordinary breath of life. In sermons and essays of freethinkers, Priestley's theology found echoes even in modern debates. His insistence that faith must welcome reason spoke to a world torn between tradition and skepticism. His courage to dissent from orthodoxy resonated with those who challenged authority in new ways, whether in religion, politics, or science. Some hailed him as a forerunner of liberal Christianity, others as a patron of secular rationalism. Each interpreted him according to need, yet each was bound to admit that his refusal to separate faith from experiment had left a mark. He was the man who tried to read the Bible and the book of nature with the same eyes, and though he stumbled in both, he left the testimony that stumbling itself is part of progress. In America, his memory mingled with that of the founding fathers. Jefferson, who had corresponded with him, honored him as a fellow apostle of liberty. Adams, though less sympathetic to his theology, admired his intellect. His home in Northumberland became a site of pilgrimage for Unitarians and scientists alike, who saw in its modest rooms the intersection of chemistry, religion, and politics. His grave was tended as a symbol that the Republic had offered refuge to a man scorned by monarchy. For immigrants who arrived later, his story was instructive, that America was a land where dissent could find shelter, where a persecuted minister could end his days in peace. By the late 20th century, historians began to revisit him with new eyes, no longer content to repeat the simple tale of discoverer or heretic. They examined the networks of dissenting academies, the Lunar Society, the interplay of theology and experiment. They saw in Priestley not merely a character in the story of oxygen, but a window into the Enlightenment's texture. His stubbornness with phlogiston was reinterpreted less as folly than as fidelity to a framework that had once explained so much. His persecution in Birmingham was read not merely as mob violence, but as a symptom of the deep anxieties that revolution stirred in Britain. His exile in America was reconsidered as part of the Atlantic circulation of ideas, a migration of dissent that shaped both continents. Thus, scholarship restored to him a complexity too long flattened by legend. Yet even amid this complexity, the central image remained, a man bending over a jar, breathing a new air. It is this image that endures because it captures the essence of what it means to inquire, to place one's own body at the threshold of knowledge, to risk, to test, to trust. This is discovery in its most human form. Priestley's life, with all its controversies and contradictions, circles back to that breath. The oxygen he misnamed has long since found its place in law and medicine, yet the courage he displayed remains unclassified, an element in the periodic table of character that continues to inspire. And so the narrative of Joseph Priestley stretches across centuries, carried like air itself, invisible yet indispensable. In every debate about the relation of science and religion, his voice echoes. In every defense of liberty of conscience, his exile is remembered. In every laboratory where a student watches a flame flare in a jar, his experiment is reenacted. He is not merely a figure of the past, but a companion in the present, reminding us that truth is not a possession, but a pursuit, that error is not defeat, but stage, that courage is not comfort, but breath. To read his life is to breathe with him, to share in that moment of astonishment when air became more than air, when faith and reason joined in a single gasp, and when discovery, however misunderstood, entered the lungs of history never to be exhaled. The generations that followed found Priestley's legacy unavoidable, for oxygen had become not only a scientific substance, but a cultural metaphor. Poets spoke of it as the breath of modernity, artists painted its discovery as a moment of enlightenment, and reformers borrowed its imagery to describe the liberation of minds from tyranny. In all these echoes, the figure of the dissenting minister persisted, bending over his jars with simple instruments, embodying the courage of inquiry in an age of upheaval. His name entered encyclopedias, sometimes with grudging acknowledgment of his errors, sometimes with lavish praise for his daring. Children in schools recited anecdotes of his mouse experiments, and even when the details blurred, the moral was clear, that truth often comes dressed in controversy, and that the line between hero and heretic is thin. The simplicity of his apparatus became part of the legend, for in a century already beginning to favor grandeur, Priestley reminded the world that discovery could emerge from humble rooms as long as curiosity burned. As science advanced, his reputation rose and fell in cycles. In the 19th century, as the chemical revolution matured, Lavoisier was praised as the true father of modern chemistry, while Priestley was relegated to a forerunner, a man who stumbled upon greatness but failed to understand it. Yet this dismissal never endured long, for scholars could not resist the drama of his story. Unlike many savants, Priestley had lived in the thick of political and religious storms, and his experiments seemed inseparable from his sermons and pamphlets. Biographers returned to him repeatedly, fascinated by the contradictions. A clergyman who undermined dogma, a scientist who defended an obsolete theory, a liberal who suffered from the violence of mobs. Each age reshaped him in its own image. Victorians saw in him a moral reformer who prefigured their own debates about reason and faith. Americans saw in him an exile who testified to their nation's role as haven for liberty. Modern historians see in him a case study of how science advances by communities rather than by solitary geniuses, for Priestley's connection to Franklin, Watt, and others shows the collaborative nature of Enlightenment. Meanwhile, the oxygen he first captured became a key to medicine. Physicians studied how it nourished tissues, how its absence suffocated life, how its controlled delivery could revive the weak. Hospitals adopted oxygen therapy, and each cylinder bore the invisible debt to Priestley's daring breath. Industrialists, too, found oxygen indispensable. Fueling furnaces, cutting steel, driving engines, the very air that Priestley once called dephlogisticated became an engine of modern civilization, and his name reappeared in technical journals as the pioneer who first isolated it. Even when chemists emphasized Lavoisier's theory, they acknowledged Priestley's discovery, for one could not have existed without the other. Together they represented two halves of progress: observation and interpretation, data and law, experience and explanation. Religious communities kept his spirit alive in different ways. Unitarians in Britain and America held annual lectures in his honor, seeing him as a founder of their tradition. They remembered his insistence that God's unity was rational, that Jesus was human, that faith could coexist with inquiry. In their pulpits, his words lived on, inspiring new generations to question and to believe simultaneously. His exile to America became part of their mythology, a story of persecution and perseverance. Even those who did not share his conclusions admired his courage, for in him they saw the model of integrity, a man who would not betray conscience even when it cost him home and honor. His story offered consolation to every dissenter who felt the weight of majority disapproval. In politics, his name appeared in debates about freedom of speech and religion. Reformers pointed to the Birmingham riots as evidence of what happens when intolerance is allowed to rule. Lawmakers cited his exile when arguing for greater protection of minority voices. In America, where the First Amendment enshrined such protections, his grave stood as a symbol of what liberty meant in practice. Foreign visitors to Pennsylvania sometimes stopped at Northumberland to pay respects, seeing in that quiet site a testimony that the Republic had offered refuge to one of Europe's most persecuted minds. Thus his political significance endured alongside his scientific and religious legacies. The image of Priestley also became a touchstone in literature. Novelists used him as a character, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes satirical. Poets invoked oxygen as a metaphor for freedom and clarity, linking it to Priestley's name. Essays used his persistence with phlogiston as a warning about clinging to old frameworks, but also as a parable about loyalty to conscience. Artists painted him with jars and lenses, capturing the moment of discovery as if it were a religious vision. In this way, he entered the cultural imagination not only as a chemist, but as a symbol of enlightenment itself. His life story was retold in lectures and exhibitions, ensuring that each new generation encountered him not only in footnotes, but in images and narratives that stirred the heart. As the 20th century moved through wars and revolutions of its own, Priestley's exile took on new meaning. Scholars compared him to refugees who fled fascism or communism, seeing in him a precedent for intellectuals who crossed oceans to preserve liberty. His modest home in America was compared to the homes of scientists who continued their work in exile, sustaining knowledge against the tides of politics. Thus, his story resonated anew, showing that the struggle between conscience and authority is perennial. His experiments with air became metaphors for freedom of thought, for just as lungs require oxygen, minds require liberty. This analogy found its way into speeches and essays, linking Priestley's breath with the breath of democracy. In laboratories, his reputation received fresh respect. Chemists studying the history of their discipline realized that Priestley's experimental methods had been more systematic than once believed. His notes revealed a careful cataloging of results, an attention to detail that anticipated modern standards. Although his adherence to phlogiston theory blinded him to the correct interpretation, his data remained invaluable. Scholars published editions of his notebooks, allowing readers to see the meticulous record-keeping that underlay his discoveries. This rehabilitation showed that Priestley was not merely a lucky amateur, but a serious experimentalist whose contributions were foundational. His courage to test, to record, to share these were the virtues of science as much as theory was. Priestley's theology also found echoes in modern debates. His insistence on rational religion anticipated later liberal theologies that sought to reconcile Scripture with modern knowledge. His rejection of mystery in favor of reason paralleled the struggles of believers in every century who grapple with science. Some criticized him for reducing faith to logic, but others admired his bravery in refusing to let superstition rule. His example encouraged many to believe that faith and reason need not be enemies. In an age of growing secularism, his name was invoked as proof that religious conviction could inspire rather than hinder inquiry. Thus he became a bridge figure, claimed both by believers who prized reason and by skeptics who prized courage. Historians of ideas placed him in the broader story of the Enlightenment. They noted how his life intersected with key themes: the rise of science, the struggle for religious tolerance, the birth of democratic politics. They saw in him a microcosm of the age, embodying both its hopes and its tensions. His errors reflected the limits of reason. His courage reflected its strength. His persecution reflected its dangers. His exile reflected its resilience. To study Priestley was to study the Enlightenment itself with all its paradoxes. His story reminded modern readers that progress is never smooth, that it often produces backlash, and that truth requires defenders willing to suffer. The commemorations of Priestley multiplied. Statues were erected in Yorkshire and Pennsylvania. Institutions bore his name. Anniversaries of his discovery of oxygen were celebrated with lectures and exhibitions. Chemists raised toasts in his honor, Unitarians preached sermons, politicians invoked his memory. Each event kept his story alive, reinforcing his place in history. Even when debates arose about the exact priority of discovery, whether Scheele or Lavoisier deserved more credit, Priestley's role remained secure. He had been the one to isolate, to breathe, to describe, and that moment could not be erased. The breath he took in 1774 continued to echo across centuries, inspiring those who sought to unite courage with inquiry. In the 21st century, his relevance did not fade. Scholars continued to publish new studies of his life, exploring his networks, his writings, his influence. Museums staged exhibitions of his apparatus. Environmentalists invoked his experiments with plants as the beginning of ecological awareness. Religious thinkers cited his rational faith as a precursor of dialogue between science and religion. Political reformers pointed to his persecution as a reminder that liberty of conscience remains fragile. In classrooms, his story was retold, not as a dusty tale, but as a living parable. Students saw in him a figure who dared to question, who dared to test, who dared to stand by conscience. His oxygen was not only a chemical substance, but a symbol of intellectual freedom. And so the life of Joseph Priestley, begun in a Yorkshire village and ending in an American exile, stretched far beyond its own boundaries. It touched science, religion, politics, and culture. It revealed the power of curiosity and the cost of dissent. It showed that discovery is not the possession of one man, but the inheritance of humanity. It proved that even in error, courage can be exemplary. The jars he filled with air became vessels of memory, carrying his story through centuries. His breath became our breath, his struggle our struggle, his legacy our legacy. In him we see not only the discoverer of oxygen, but the discoverer of freedom itself, for to breathe is to live, and to think freely is to be fully human. Priestley gave us both, and though his name may sometimes fade into footnotes, his gift endures in every lung and every mind that refuses to suffocate under ignorance or tyranny. Priestley's reputation, even long after his death, carried an ambiguity that kept scholars, theologians, and scientists debating him as if he were still alive. In the great lecture halls of Europe, professors invoked his name when teaching the birth of modern chemistry, pausing to note how easily human genius can stumble when tethered to old frameworks. They admired his tenacity while cautioning students not to let loyalty to theory blind them to evidence. And yet, at the same time, they presented his story as evidence that discovery is often collective, built by many hands and many minds, none of whom can claim exclusive possession of truth. In this way, Priestley became the embodiment of science as a human process, full of trial and error, courage and misinterpretation. He was remembered not for being perfect, but for being daring, and daring, in the eyes of future generations, mattered more than perfection. The Unitarians who cherished him carried his writings across continents, and in their libraries his volumes remained open on desks, their margins scribbled with questions by new readers. They saw in him not only a father of their theology, but also a companion spirit who gave permission to think freely, to dissent respectfully but firmly, and to stand one's ground in the face of overwhelming opposition. In chapel services, his story was retold as a parable of conscience. Children learned that a man could be driven from his homeland for believing differently, yet still make discoveries that change the world. This paradox became the very definition of faith joined with reason, for Priestley's exile was cast not as defeat, but as testimony. He had lost England, but he had kept truth, and to those who valued conscience above comfort, that exchange was victory. Politically, radicals continued to claim him as proof that states must defend liberty of thought. The Birmingham riots became a cautionary tale in the rhetoric of reformers, warning governments that intolerance breeds instability. Pamphlets reprinted his words on freedom of inquiry, citing them in debates about education and rights. Even in countries far removed from his life, reformers found in Priestley a symbol of courage. His story circulated in translations, showing that the struggle between conscience and authority was not English alone, but universal. He became, in a sense, an international figure, an exile whose ideas belonged everywhere, whose breath carried across borders like air itself. Meanwhile, oxygen, the element that bound his name forever to science, became central to new revolutions in medicine and technology. As anesthesia developed, as hyperbaric chambers were built, as space travel required careful management of air, Priestley's initial jar seemed both quaint and profound. Scientists marveled that so much could begin with so little. They placed replicas of his apparatus in museums and textbooks, letting students see that discovery need not require vast machines, but could spring from curiosity armed with simple tools. His experiment was reenacted countless times, candles flickering in jars before the eyes of schoolchildren who gasped with the same wonder that once filled Priestley himself. This ritual kept his memory alive, renewing with each generation the thrill of discovery. Historians deepened their study of him, publishing volumes that examined every facet: his upbringing in Yorkshire, his dissenting education, his friendships with Franklin and Watt, his role in the Lunar Society, his persecution and exile, his theology, his politics. They pieced together letters and diaries, reconstructing not only what he did but how he thought. What emerged was a portrait more complex than either hero worship or dismissal. They found in him a man driven by conscience, quick to controversy, generous in friendship, stubborn in debate, courageous in experiment, and always restless. He was not a tidy figure, but history itself is not tidy, and perhaps that is why he remained compelling. To study Priestley was to study the entanglement of science, religion, and politics in the Enlightenment, to see how one man's life could illuminate an age's contradictions. As the Enlightenment gave way to modernity, Priestley's place in memory shifted again. He was no longer only the chemist who discovered oxygen or the minister who challenged the Trinity. He became a lens through which people examined the very nature of progress. Was progress linear, inevitable, triumphant? Priestley's story suggested otherwise. It showed that progress comes through conflict, error, resistance, exile. It showed that discovery is as much about character as about intellect. It showed that courage can matter more than clarity. And so his life became a meditation for philosophers who wondered about the meaning of history. They saw in him both greatness and limitation, and in that mixture they saw humanity itself. Cultural institutions honored him in diverse ways. Statues were unveiled, schools named after him, prizes awarded in his memory. In each commemoration, his legacy was reframed. Some emphasized the scientific pioneer, others the religious dissenter, others the political exile, but all acknowledged that his breath still filled the atmosphere of history. To speak his name was to remember that inquiry can be dangerous, that truth can divide, but that without such courage the world would suffocate. This became his final metaphor, that just as oxygen sustains life, liberty of thought sustains civilization, and both require defenders willing to risk everything. In the 21st century, when debates about science and faith, liberty and authority, truth and misinformation continued to rage, Joseph Priestley's story returned with new relevance. Scholars wrote books about him, not merely as history, but as commentary on the present. They pointed out that he lived in an age of upheaval, of revolutions, of polarized opinions, of fragile liberties. They showed that his courage to dissent, his willingness to stand by conscience, and his trust in reason spoke directly to modern challenges. His errors, too, were instructive, warning that loyalty to outdated frameworks can blind even the brightest minds. Thus his life became both inspiration and caution, reminding us to be courageous, but also to be humble. And so, as long as air is breathed and liberty is valued, Priestley's story will endure. His jars may be empty, his house may be quiet, his grave may be still, but the breath he took in 1774 continues. It fills our lungs, it animates our debates, it inspires our conscience. Joseph Priestley remains among us, not as a relic, but as a living force, invisible like oxygen, essential like liberty, enduring like truth itself.